And you've dug into just about every election since then. If every election, right?
Every election.
Every election.
Every election.
And so this has not stopped you from...
No, it actually impassioned me. It emboldened me because, I'm doing two investigations at the same time. One is I'm investigating what they did to me, the arrest. And we may talk about that later. Because I was very suspicious that it was pre-planned, it was a setup, and as I started to do open record requests, I found out I had documentation that proved it was a setup. And then I started getting documentation that the county was trying to cover up on elections. So I had both of these things going on simultaneously, and both of them made me want to dig harder for the other. So it was like I was doubly motivated. But I also found, Melody, very early on, I really got a sense that the Lord had me on a mission. And I told the Lord early on in this whole process, and this started before my arrest with the elections, that if he would give me the steps to take, I would take them. If he needed me to sacrifice money or time, I would sacrifice it. And I would just go wherever he wanted me to go. And that's the journey I think he started on. And I think he has a way bigger mission than me personally. And it's not just about elections, it's about corruption in our government. And our corrupt government controls the elections, is what I've discovered. And that's the real reason they wanted to arrest me.
That was going to be my next question. Why come after you? I mean, you've been kind of a low-key guy, just living life.
That's right. Doing my own thing, not controversial. I don't go down and protest at county commission meetings until this election issue started coming up, and I started finding massive violations of serious election law, and I just couldn't walk away from that.
So why fight so hard now?
Well, I've invested a lot of time, energy, and effort into it, but it seems like the more I dig, the more I realize that it goes way beyond Floyd County. It goes all the way to the top state levels. And I know it goes nationally, but see, I was one of these that thought this kind of stuff goes on in Los Angeles or New York or, Philadelphia, but not in rural Rome, Georgia. But now that I realize the corruption may be worse here than a lot of those places. And this is where I've lived. This is my home. I've got a family here. I'm trying to raise a grandchild. I want him to have a good future. And so I just couldn't turn my back from all this corruption. And I believe what the Lord ultimately wanted is he wants to free our Floyd County from the grip of these gangsters. And I think God was just looking around for anybody who would say, I'll do it. And I was stupid enough to say, okay, I'll do it.
Now, you do have some what I call special skills for this.
I do. I graduated from Berry College with a degree in internal audit. I had a minor in economics and accounting. I went into the banking business and worked 27 years. And like I said, last 8, I was president and CEO of a community bank. I like to tease and say that I'm the most audited person in Georgia. When the bank got into trouble during the Great Recession, we had auditors in and out of our bank literally all year round, every year. We had some group always auditing. So not only is my degree in audit, but I've been audited. So I know what it's like to be audited. I know what auditors look for. I know as an auditor what to look for. But I've also had all these audit reports so I've learned and honed my auditing skills over the years from being audited so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I just believe between my education and my work history, I also learned how to develop spreadsheets, and I'm very organized. And I believe a lot of those traits God allowed me to have for this time.
Let me ask you this, because you allude this, you don't think it's just Floyd County. You're surprised it was Floyd County, but it's not just Floyd County. Yeah. You've also looked at, you said 12 counties in the area. That was the 2024 election. So you don't think it was just 2020. You think it's every election.
It's been every election.
Because you found similarities
in other counties.
In at least 5 other counties.
That's right.
You mentioned. Okay. So is it, and then you mentioned that you think it's nationally. So what do you mean? You mentioned before when we were talking that our election is an illusion. Would you go into why you would say that?
So I have concluded myself, and I feel like I have enough evidence that in a court, I could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that our elections are not constitutional. Our elections haven't followed the law, really any part of the law since 2020. But it wasn't until the 2024 election that I had finally learned a lot through those other audits. I also had connected myself to election experts and computer experts all across the country. And the 24 election, I have made the most comprehensive audit that I think you can make and not work for the election office. Because again, as a citizen, I can't just go down there and hang out and say, hey, give me this, let me look in this. I just have to ask for documents. So I can only audit to the extent they have a document to give me. But I can tell you unequivocally that our elections are an illusion. And something unique happened in the 24 election to prove that it wasn't just Floyd County, it was actually the whole state. And it also led me to conclude fairly decisively that Georgia may not even be in control of the elections. There's a company called Enhanced Voting that I discovered that we contract with that is ultimately in charge of the elections. And what I have found is they can control and manipulate the data at their level. Now, who's ultimately making those decisions? I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that at every level of our election process, whether it's your local county commissioner, all the way up to the governor and senators, and for president, it's all an illusion.
Now, people, I'm sure you've heard this. People say, "Oh, but it's been debunked. Yeah. It hasn't been proven in court. Yeah. It's our elections are safe and secure." Yeah. And people that say it's not are crazy. Just let it go. Yep. Would you just kind of address all of those?
Yeah. So here's the thing that I've discovered. I had somebody come into my world. It's a dear friend of mine. He's since passed. But he began to really open my eyes to the power of our Georgia Constitution and federal Constitution. That's really our contract with the government, that they have to abide by the contract if we're going to allow them to be in charge. But ultimately, the people are in charge. And what I discovered is there's a clause in our Georgia Constitution that requires our elections to be in accordance with the law. So if our elections are not done in accordance with the law, they're not constitutional. Nobody has made that argument yet in court. Nobody. Everybody's trying to argue various sections of the code that maybe are not done correctly, but nobody's made the argument that a violation of law renders the election unconstitutional. What people have tried to argue also is a lot of out-of-town people have tried to make legal arguments, and 95% of those lawsuits, they were dismissed because of lack of standing. So somebody in Arizona can't come and file a court suit here about elections and expect to get very far because they didn't participate in the election. So that means they don't have standing. If you don't have standing, you're in the wrong court. So 95% of people say, well, it's been debunked. No, it has not been debunked. It's judges don't want to deal with it, so they dismissed it for lack of standing.
Because I know even some voters in Georgia filed lawsuits in Georgia, and it was dismissed on lack of standing.
It was still dismissed on lack of standing. Now there's a fairly recent, I think it's about a year old, that actually a federal judge determined that if you voted in the election, you do have standing. But I don't know that anybody's initiated a lawsuit since then. Most of that activity was done in 2020 and 2021, and after you get shot down 100 times, people quit trying.
Now, what was one of the most, and you talked a little bit about this earlier, but what's one of the most shocking or surprising things when you started looking in to these elections that you thought, I can't believe this?
Probably the biggest shock occurred in the 4 elections before 24. So our election system is a Dominion voting system, and all of the ballots are ran through what's called tabulators. And your viewers might be familiar, if they voted in Georgia, that you vote on an iPad, it transmits the data over to a printer. You take the printed results, you can read it, but there's a QR code. You take that piece of paper and you stick it in a scanner. That's called a tabulator. And that tabulator, at the end of the day, has a printout that looks like a long CVS receipt. They can sometimes be 8 feet long, literally, because they have all of the election information from the ballots that went through that scanner. So at the end of the night, the election folks are supposed to print 3 copies of that long CVS tape. It requires 3 signatures from people who've taken an oath, who watch those ballots go through, and they certify that the votes are accurate. It takes 3 people. So when I started, it was one of the first things I started asking for is I want to look at these tapes, and what I discovered is for the vast majority, for 60, 70, 80% of the votes in all the elections starting in 2020, I don't have those tapes. Now here's the problem. The law says those are the official returns. Well, if I don't have the official returns, how can you certify an election? And that was the biggest shocking moment to me, was we can't prove our elections. Now, we can take the ballots that people scanned and we can count those, but how do we know those are the ballots that went through the machine? The only way we can know those are the ballots that went through the machine is that signed tape. Otherwise, those ballots can all be pre-printed fake ballots. And I believe that's why the tapes were missing, is because all the ballots were swapped out for different ballots. And the original ballots that people actually thought they cast are in the bottom of a lake shredded. And all new ballots came in. And the only way that you would find that out is if you kept the tape and then you did a count, you did an audit and took the tape totals against the ballot totals. And if they didn't match, you had a problem. And the law says if you count the ballots and you count the tapes and there's not a match, the tapes win. So if you don't have 80% of the votes on the tapes,
how do you know?
It's an illusion.
Let me ask you this. Do you think, and I know you're most familiar with Floyd County, so let's kind of step back.
Correct.
Is it people that deliberately did these illegal things, or were they just inadvertently did it because that's what they were following, their procedures they were told to do and they didn't know any better?
No, I think there was a lot of deliberate actions. I think there were 2 things. There was a lot of, and I hate to say it, there was a lot of incompetent people hired to run our elections during this time. And they were hired for their incompetency, so that they would just do what they're told and not question anything. But a lot of people like me across the state were figuring a lot of this kind of stuff out and calling the election offices out that they had to change the strategy because they knew that wasn't going to continue to work because we were on to them. So they figured out a way to make the tape part work. So now I've got tapes, but they went and did an internal, they're changing the election through electronic methods. And they can make all that match up in the electronic methods.
And this may be, you may know this or you may not, but how many ways do you think the election's been cheated?
Well, here's the deal. We have known since elections began that there's always cheating, okay? But the idea is there's not enough cheating to really change the outcome of the election. So we've sort of had to, as a society, say, we're not going to be perfect, but we're going to be close enough. Well, the problem is leading up to the 2016 election, I believe there was 100 different ways to cheat. And they thought they had it all covered up. and Hillary was supposed to win, and Trump won because they didn't have a backup plan. What if more people showed up than they expected? They had cheating in, but they only had so much cheating in, they didn't have enough to overcome the people that voted for Trump in 16. And so they decided then they had to figure out a new method. And the method I've discovered is the backup method. They can change those votes after the election. And that's what I've caught them doing in 2024. It's changing the votes after the election.
So it take days and...
That's right.
Now, people that are on devil's advocate side of this, they say, well, Trump won in 2024, so how can you say they're still going on? So explain that.
Yeah, so after doing a lot of studying and digging and looking, the elections were an illusion, okay? So I can't tell you that the powers that be let Trump win, or my theory is the elections aren't just about the president. That's kind of what we all get worked up for, that it's the presidential election is what brings people out. But the elections are for school boards, for county commissions, city commissions, and that's really what the government wants to control. Because one man as president, they've shown us they can control the presidency. They got 100 different ways to keep the president hemmed in. But they got to control all the activity at the ground level, because that's where you really influence the population. The president really doesn't have that much influence over the population. So I believe there were so many people that came out for the 24 election to vote for Trump that it was so overwhelming that to maintain the ruse, they had to let him win. Because they would have had to cheat so much that it would be too obvious. And they couldn't afford to give up the con. So they let Trump win, knowing they could hem him in order to keep the con and cover all the down ballot elections.
What's something about election process, or a couple of things that you think people probably don't realize that they should know?
So I think this is going to be a controversial statement, certainly in the conservative group. I personally think that if we conduct the elections in Georgia by the law, it will be virtually impossible to cheat. But we don't run our elections according to the law, and that's where the cheating comes in. So I think the biggest misconception is a lot of people in conservative circles say, well, it's the Dominion equipment. Well, the Dominion equipment is part of the problem. But there's 3 auditable sources in our Dominion system that if we compared, there's a memory card that comes out that has all the ballot counts, there's a tape that comes out that has all the ballot counts, it's signed by 3 people, and we have a ballot. And if all of those things are managed according to the law, they all 3 will end up balancing, and there'll be a very difficult way to cheat. But the entire system it's nothing is being run according to the law. So that's the biggest misconception, I think, out there, or the biggest thing that people don't realize is if we ran it according to the law, we probably wouldn't be having this problem. But the problem is we don't run it according to the law, and nobody cares. In fact, I think the politicians know quite well we're not running it by the law. The court system knows quite well, but they're all beneficiaries of the vote, right? So if they want to stay in office, they don't want that in your hands. They want that in their hands, because we might get mad at them and vote for somebody else. So it behooves the government. They have a vested interest in controlling the outcome of the elections. They don't want it in our hands because we might vote them out.
And the same goes for these judicial people of not wanting to overturn an election.
And a lot of those at the local level are elected positions. Our Superior Court judges are elected positions. So now you have a Superior Court judge that makes a great living, retire for a lifetime, and now, you put them in a position, do they really want to tear up the elections because, God forbid, somebody else run for judge to get it? So you got an entire government system that's incented to make sure the elections aren't in the people's hands.
Now, a podcaster famously says, I like a lot, says, it's a crime organization. It's a criminal organization.
It is
everything.
The entire government structure is a mob.
So how do people, we the people, how do we overcome this and correct it if we don't have the judges, the elected people?
We're toast. So we got a choice. We can either assert our rightful place that our founders laid in our constitutional documents, that we're in charge. We can start to assert that, for number one, but we haven't. We've abdicated our authority to the government. And we've decided that football and Oprah reruns are more important than our civic duties. Only about 20 to 30% of the population votes in the presidential primaries. And when you get into the lower down ballot races and the local races, you may only have 3 or 4% of the population voting at all.
We have a public service commission
coming up,
that virtually nobody,
maybe a few thousand people will vote in Floyd County. So the first thing we got to decide is, do we want control? I mean, that's not a small question, Melody. The question is, are we okay with tyranny? Are we okay with the government having complete and total control? Or do we want our own freedom? And that's an individual decision. And I can tell you, it won't take everybody. It will just take enough. I happened to go, side story, I happened to go to I went to Boston on business last year. And I got to go to the Boston Tea Party. There's a very touristy kind of attraction down in the port, supposedly where it all happened. But it's very well done. I would highly recommend anybody that does this, but my eyes were opened. I had heard about the Boston Tea Party. I knew a little bit about it, but it turns out the people of Boston had gotten tired of England demanding more and more tax. The Boston Tea Party was over a 3-cent tax. Pittance. But it was the principle. And what a couple of hundred people, as it turned out, 130 men, was all that it took. And they threw all the tea in the harbor to send a message back to England, no more. 130 people. Well, I didn't realize this, but that was a year before the Declaration of Independence was signed, that event. And that event actually sparked the revolution that led to the Declaration of Independence. And it was 130 people. It wasn't 10,000, 100,000. It was 130 men who said, I want freedom. I don't want to live under the authority of the tyrants in England. And that led to the Declaration of Independence and the creation ultimately of our Constitution, which enshrined the ability for us to be in charge of our destiny, not the government. But we've got to decide, do we want to just let the government have it and we'll take whatever they give us? Or do we want to get it back?
A lot of local media here, but none of them wanted to look at this.
They refused to. It's almost comical how they won't engage. They won't ask a question. I've been on this quest, very public quest, in court, pretty famous around town, and not one time, except for one kind of small media, but even they all had limits, but nobody has called me for an interview. A reporter hasn't called locally to sit down with me and do a story. They haven't called to say, hey, what's going on with the arrest? We hear you're a good guy. Why do you think you've been arrested? Mm-hmm. They have no interest. I've engaged them, and they just will not cover it. And the only thing I can conclude is they're complicit.
Complicit, or do you think they're afraid?
I don't think it's fear. I think they're complicit because they benefit from political spending.
Kind of wrap this up. You say that the best thing people can do is to get involved locally, go to meetings, vote, pay attention, ask for records, hold their individual elected officials and people accountable.
Go to my Facebook page. We meet every Thursday. There's lots of ways they can get involved and take action that they don't have to do crazy things like picket or, riot or anything like that. There's very simple things that are not very expensive. It just takes time and effort. But if one person does it, they can just flick that one person off.
And so go to your Facebook page to find out about the meetings? Is that what you're
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And I'll put
and also about what I'm finding in the elections, what I'm finding about the collusion of the government against me. I post all the evidence of all of that, and I write articles about it on my Facebook page.
And one final question, because we hadn't addressed this, but I'm certainly going to address it in this. Everything that you say, you have documents that you've actually gotten from
exactly
the people you're talking about, the government agencies you're talking about. You requested them, so you've actually got the documents.
That's right.
That's okay.
Open records. Yeah, open records request. So all of my evidence is not me kind of looking for it. I know what I'm asking for. I ask the county for the documents that they're supposed to have, and they have to give it to me. So everything that I say, I can prove with documents that came directly from the county.
Very good. All right, thank you very much for talking
Absolutely.
with me and sharing this. I've been wanting to talk to you for quite a while about this, so I'm glad we had this opportunity, and we're going to post this, and hopefully it'll help people in all counties, because it's not just Floyd, to ask questions and get involved in their local counties.
And don't let them think that their county is okay, because no county is okay in Georgia, is what I've discovered.
Okay. Thank you.